Back in the early 2000s, the Smackdown series was one of the most highly anticipated annual franchises in video games. Despite critical acclaim and almost universal praise from the fanbase, the Smackdown series always had a habit of showing things that weren't actually in the official releases. As a young teenager, I used to sit and daydream, what if the attires looked like they did in the previews for Smackdown 2? What if the moves in Smackdown Just Bring It looked like they did in the previews? What if the season mode in Smackdown Shut Your Mouth looked like it did in the previews? What if the characters were never removed in Smackdown Here Comes the Pain? What if I could move all of Smackdown Shut Your Mouth's characters into Here Comes the Pain? So for the past 4 years, I've been adding, re-adding, and...
Caution! Attention!
Now I know. This episode was meant to be Smackdown Shut Your Mouth. But Smackdown Just Bring It and Smackdown Shut Your Mouth stories are so intertwined that we have to go here first. Don't worry, Smackdown Shut Your Mouth will be next episode, I promise. But for now, I'm Scott J, and this is Rebuilding Smackdown, Episode 2, Just Bring It. By the fall of 2000, the PlayStation 2 was released in all major territories. A few notable titles withstanding, the system would be met with criticism, often being called a PS1 with a DVD player, by fans of Sega's 6th generation console, the Dreamcast. In 2001, all of that was about to change, as a slew of visually mesmerizing, new and interesting titles, such as The Bouncer, Shadow of Memories, Zone of the Enders, Onimusha Warlords, Max Payne, and Devil May Cry, along with what had become PlayStation faithful titles, like Gran Turismo 3, A-Spec, Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, Grand Theft Auto 3, and Final Fantasy X, all of which would be released in 2001. There was one other highly anticipated title for PlayStation 2, one which would even rival Metal Gear Solid 2 in terms of coverage over the next year. In July of 2000, Smackdown 2 was well on its way to meeting its full release date. At an industry event of the same month, THQ announced that Smackdown 3 would soon be going into development, aiming for a mid-2001 release date and launching on Sony's brand new PlayStation 2 console. After a few months of basking in the glory of the releases of WWF SmackDown 2 Know Your Role and WWF No Mercy, THQ was riding a high. But then on April 26, 2001, they announced SmackDown 3 had an official name, WWF SmackDown Just Bring It. Unlike years prior following the name announcement, there was no other information. No screenshots, no videos. Just THQ promising to share more at that year's E3. Now I wasn't in the industry for this E3. I was actually in my last year of high school, but I've compiled as much information as possible to convey what the reaction to Smackdown Just Bring It was like, starting with my former manager, who gave me an awesome quote. Check it out. To the average gamer, you'd really think we'd be trying to get the scoop on titles like Gran Turismo or Metal Gear Solid, but the person that doesn't visit video game websites or buy video game magazines regularly, they want Smackdown. And for our post-E3 issue, we did a 7 or 8 page spread for Smackdown, which did really well. On May 17, 2001, E3 began. The show floor was packed with tons of new titles for the PlayStation 2, as well as newly announced games for Nintendo's GameCube and Microsoft's Xbox, with many in the industry still shocked at Sega's decision to pull out of the console war altogether and become a third-party developer. Despite the massive amount of AAA titles being available for preview, press from both the internet and print media flocked to THQ's booth, which, while not larger than usual, had a much more devoted presence to WWF SmackDown Just Bring It. While some were trying to get interviews and appointments, others were recording over the shoulder, in the hopes to upload the first real gameplay footage of Just Bring It. The show floor demo itself featured most match types available, with up to 4 wrestlers, not including interference. Playable wrestlers available were The Rock, Triple H, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Undertaker, Lita, Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, and Chris Jericho, with a lot of the remaining roster as non-playable interference. THQ also had a dedicated video screen showing off staged gameplay footage, which would also be given out as a press CD/DVD, showing off what was to be some of the game's new features, such as a pay-per-view recap, assumed by many to be from the game's season/story mode, new ways to interact with weapons, including Chris Jericho performing the Walls of Jericho atop a ladder. In the midst of people clamoring for interviews, photos, and footage, THQ representatives were actually giving different information regarding the game's season or story mode to different media outlets. This depended on who was actually giving the interview. IGN, GamePro, GameSpot, PSW, Official PlayStation Magazine, PSM2, PSI, while they all had similar information when it came to the game's season or story mode. Some would say it was a season mode much like Smackdown 2, whereas others would say it was a brand new story mode, which led me to believe, did THQ actually know at the time? One of the most interesting things to come out of E3 2001 at the time was PSM2's interview with THQ, where they spoke to one representative confirming season mode, and another confirming story mode.
Like you have a card, a lineup, a card for a pay-per-view or Smackdown or whatever particular show it is, and it'll be the same. There'll be an entire card listing of each match that takes place, and you'll be able to either watch them or participate in those matches.
We're also changing our season mode to a story mode, and it'll be more based on your character. It's going to be more like a road to the championship. You got to fight your way to get the belt.
Was there a season mode much like SmackDown 2 Know Your Roles, already implemented or being implemented into SmackDown Just Bring It, and then being changed into a story mode due to the critical reception and fan reception of SmackDown 2 season mode? While SmackDown 2 season mode is excellent, fans and critics complained about the life bar-like simulation for CPU matches during season, as opposed to the critical and fan-praised No Mercy story mode, which was a lot more like the road to the title stories that Corey Ledesma mentioned in the E3 interview. In reality though, if you took away the life bar-like simulation for the CPU matches, SmackDown 2 season mode had far more longevity and much more replayability, due to it being an endless season with superstar stats and title records. Now the reason why nobody batted an eyelid at this at the time was because, well, one man's season is another man's story mode. Basically, it could just mean the same thing. It was going to be a full year and you were going to get to play it. That's really all people cared about at the time. Inconsistencies aside, E3 was a roaring success for THQ, and especially Smackdown Just Bring It, driving up internet traffic for all sites that covered it, and bolstered magazine sales that offered any new information or a glimpse of any new screenshots. For the rest of June and July that year, information would slowly trickle out, with THQ releasing selected screenshots and movies to various outlets. August 2001 finally came around, and in-depth looks, previews, and even the Smackdown countdown began to flood the internet. Magazines offered pages upon pages of in-depth previews on Smackdown Just Bring It. With most of the major US and European outlets now having access to preview builds, fans were treated to a variety of content. Match clips, game modes, glimpses of what we thought were alternate attires, create a superstar, and full-length superstar entrances. One feature notably absent in these preview builds, which was a fully rendered interactable Michael Cole and Taz, which THQ assured people would be able to interact, including attack the announcers and put them through their own announce tables. Nevertheless, this was just a preview build. Of course it would be in the final release. This was shaping up to be the most amazing game ever. Previews of story mode alone could justify that. I mean, they've only shown us the first Raw and the first Smackdown of the year, and with the exception of translation issues, a year of this is going to be downright incredible. Those were the thoughts of anyone following this game in the lead up to release. And why wouldn't they be? THQ had built up a ton of goodwill with the releases of WrestleMania 2000, No Mercy, SmackDown 1, and SmackDown 2 had just become the best-selling PlayStation game of all time in Europe. Now, anticipation for Smackdown Just Bring It was at an all-time high. I myself remembering me and my buddies coming into school and just bringing different magazines into class and looking over the different shots. Judging from the game's coverage, it looked like the game was set in the middle of 2000 and ended a short time after WrestleMania 17. And while some fans were disappointed in the current invasion angle not being present in Smackdown Just Bring It, my friends and I, and a lot of the people I knew, were over the moon that this would be covering the rest of the year 2000, leading all the way to WrestleMania 17 or just after. We even went as far as to make note of all the attires we'd seen, like Kurt Angle in his blue No Mercy singlet, to then being in his red singlet of May of 2001, Chris Jericho having his classic yellow lightning tights, as well as the attire from TLC 3, Ivory still being in her right to censor gimmick, and Steve Austin still having both red and black braces. Our only questions were, how many attires per wrestler? Would this be like WWF No Mercy, where each wrestler had between 3 to 4 attires? Or would it be like WWF SmackDown 2, where the updated attire would become the new default, and the old attires we'd seen we could recreate and create a superstar? The latter is more likely, as the former became a feature in Smackdown Shut Your Mouth, although neither would appear in Just Bring It. But that isn't the fault of THQ or Ukes. You see, whomever was now in charge at the WWF in relation to communications with THQ had some bizarre requests, citing that editing in-game wrestlers or even recreating them in Create a Superstar with their in-game models is not to be allowed. Both THQ and Uke stated in several interviews over the coming years that this was at the request of the WWF and soon to be WWE, not something they wanted to do themselves. And unfortunately, this feature would not return until WWE 2K15, a full 13 years later. So if you're like me, who is dreaming of several backstage attires for someone like Steve Austin or The Rock, and several ring singlets for Kurt Angle or tights for Chris Jericho, you would just bang out of luck, although none of this was known publicly before release. And then finally, on November 16th and November 18th respectively, 2001, WWF SmackDown Just Bring It was released in Europe and North America. Now at the time, my disappointment in the game was quite evident. Where were all the attires that I'd seen in magazine previews and internet coverage? Why can't I do the Walls of Jericho on top of a ladder like I saw in the trailers? Why can't I attack Michael Cole and Taz like the magazines told me I could? Why is the season only 3 levels, or story mode rather, only 3 levels, instead of a full year like they said it was going to be? And if you know me, it's also the little things. Some would try to argue that SmackDown Just Bring It was the first critical low for the series, but actually it wasn't. Quite the opposite, in fact. It was generally well reviewed, and at the time, garnered quite a positive reaction from the casual fan base. Of course, the hardcore WWF fans and detail nuts like myself were really disappointed, but the SmackDown series was just so big at the time, it's really hard to overstate that. There was a huge segment of the audience who were playing these games who weren't WWF fans, they weren't even wrestling fans. These were just fun multiplayer video games. There were people that got into WWF and pro wrestling in general due to playing SmackDown at a friend's house, or due to a review score, and being one of the must-have PlayStation or PlayStation 2 games. The SmackDown brand was now more than just synonymous with WWF. It had become synonymous with PlayStation. It wouldn't be until several years later, with THQ's continued chase for critical success, that would lead to their decline in sales and fan interest. Okay, let's talk about build differences. As far as I know, there are 4 different SmackDown Just Bring It builds. E3 2001, US preview build, European preview build, and review build. Let's take a look. In the E3 2001 build, the first thing that will become apparent to you is seeing the fully rendered character models of Michael Cole and Taz commentating in the bottom right corner of the screen. This was meant to pop up every time something big or dramatic happened during your match, and as I mentioned before, if you went over to the announcer's booth, if you changed your targets to either Michael Cole or Taz, you could hit them with a devastating move of your choice, as they were fully interactive character models. As I mentioned before, this isn't even in the preview build of the game, so while I don't have any concrete evidence to why this is not in the final game, I think it's safe to assume that while they were aiming for 9 characters on screen at a time, Michael Cole and Taz being there as well would just be too much for the system to handle. Another thing which is in this build and not in any others is the WrestleMania 17 arena with The Rock, Steve Austin, and Triple H's faces on the Minitron. Now this was likely just a placeholder and why it isn't in any other version. Lastly, while it's unknown whether this build contains the full roster in its files, for the wrestlers that are available, this build contains the earliest completed attires, such as Billy Gunn having his Armageddon 2000 attire, which he wore against Chris Benoit, instead of the blue One Billy Gunn attire that he has on the preview and retail release builds. And this might not be the only superstar with a different attire, it's unfortunately the only one I know of. Okay, now we're going to talk about the preview builds. As far as I know, the US and European preview builds are exactly the same, minus 2 details. In the European build, Steve Austin has the red leg braces, and in the US build, he has black. The only other notable difference in the European build is that it has Titantrons available, whereas the US preview build does not. Now, of course, these are the only differences I could tell through looking at footage. I have no access to a US preview build. If I did get one, I would of course comb the files and see what was on the disc there. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at everything I've taken from the European preview build and put back into the final game, as well as what changes were made to the final game in lead up to release. Okay, let's talk character models. Much like you saw in Rebuilding Smackdown Episode 1 for Here Comes the Pain, the preview builds of these games sometimes feature much better character models. I'm not talking about different attires, I am talking about better sculpted, better models that are sometimes changed at the time of release. Smackdown Just Bring It also has this issue, but luckily I was able to get every single one of those models and put them back in. Let's take a look. First up, what you see here is retail footage of Mick Foley in story mode. Now you may be wondering, well, what's wrong with this? Well, nothing if you've never seen the preview build of Mick Foley. And after you do, just like me, you won't be able to unsee the preview build of Mick Foley. As now when I look at this retail release, the last minute hair that was added to his head is hideous. Now let's take a look at the preview build. Doesn't that look better and more natural to the model? So you're probably wondering, why was this changed? Well, Smackdown Just Bring It initially was meant to meet a mid-2001 release date. All of the original attires in the game started from the last 6 months of the year 2000, leading all the way up to just after WrestleMania 17. However, this is no fault of Yuke's. Due to the sudden buyout of WCW and ECW by WWF and the invasion angle, fans were voicing their displeasure online and to magazine outlets as to how out of date this game actually seemed. So to Yuke's credit, they tried to update the game with a few little things, like Foley's hair and a few other things we'll cover in a minute. But overall, I really prefer the original model. As you know, and I've said before, I always like the games to be a reflection on the previous year of television. For those that wanted it, yes, you got an up-to-date Mick Foley, but the model was far worse than the original. Luckily though, this original model is now back in and fully playable. The other model I've put back in is Ivory. Ivory returns in her right to censor outfit, which was in all previews up until final release, where the model was quickly changed due to the gimmick change. Now, much like Mick Foley, Triple H also underwent some minor changes in the hair department, making his hair slightly shorter in the retail version than what it is in the preview build. I've restored the preview build model with the longer hair, reflecting more a late 2000 look rather than an early 2001 look. Attire is also added back into the final release. I've added back in Kurt Angle's blue strap-down No Mercy singlet, Chris Jericho's yellow lightning attire, Devon wearing the blue camo trousers. While I realize this doesn't match Bubba like it does in the final release, but as usual I always think it's nice to have the things that we might have never actually got. Big Show is wearing his trunks from the Royal Rumble 2001, minus the shirt. Hardcore and Crash Holly are both in their more iconic blue and pink attires rather than the green and black that is in the final release. Jeff Hardy is back in the see-through mesh, which matches much better with Matt. Taz is in the attire he was originally shown in without the elbow pad. And funny enough, there are 3 variants for the definitive edition of Just Bring It. Stephanie and Shane McMahon both have ring gear, which are optional because I know some people probably want them in street clothes. And then, along with them as a variant, Stone Cold Steve Austin will have the red leg braces instead of the default black. But as I said, these 3 attires are variants, so in the regular version, Shane and Stephanie will have normal clothes and Steve will have black leg braces. Okay, now we're going to take a look at story mode. And while I can't do anything to increase the length of story mode and make it a full year long like it should be, what I can show you are dialogue discrepancies between the preview and retail builds of the game. Let's take a look. First of all, the last week recap that was shown at E3 is actually still in the game, in every version of the game in fact. In fact, the last week sign is still in the assets of WrestleMania 17's arena files. You see, this was simply just made for the trailer, or maybe it was also made for story mode when it was going to be a season. Who can say? The animation data is also in the preview build with Triple H and Stone Cold attacking The Rock. However, that has been removed from the retail build. A fun story tidbit is that the season mode in the preview build is actually exactly the same as in the final release. Imagine reviewers' shock when they got review code and the only thing that had changed in season mode was the localization. It literally was a Raw, a Smackdown, and then WrestleMania, and that was it. All you had to do was defend your titles afterward. Funnily enough, even though the preview build has incomplete dialogue, in some instances, what's finished is actually better, featuring more cursing and sometimes gems like this. So what I've done is I've gone through the story mode file in the preview build and the story mode file in the retail release, and I fused them together. So when you download the definitive edition, you will have the definitive story mode. So you'll have the better dialogue where finished, and then where not, it will be the default dialogue. While I can't make season mode any longer, I hope this is still fun for you guys to check out and play. Alright, now we're going to take a look at the moves. Some moves that were shown off during preview, move changes, and some last minute additions for the retail release. Let's take a look. Alright, let's talk moves. From the start of the game's preview cycle all the way up until final release, The Rock was shown using a brand new animated rock bottom, which mirrored a lot of his matches in 2000 and early 2001, with a little taunt at the end for bonus flair. This actually didn't make it into release though. Right before release, Ukes decided to reanimate the rock bottom again, this time using the July 30th episode of Monday Night Raw as a reference. In that night, The Rock returned and rock bottom Vince McMahon and Shane McMahon. At the time, I thought, oh, cool, that's fine. I mean, this is for rock and streetwear, which we don't have, so I'll just change it to the other rock bottom. I look and create a moveset, it's not there. I then look for the Smackdown 2 rock bottom, with no theatrics at all. That's not there. How can this be? How can the game's cover star not have multiple variations of his finisher? Steve Austin has multiple variations of the stunner, Kurt Angle has it for the Olympic slam, Triple H has it for the pedigree, yet for some reason, The Rock's was just overwritten. And my biggest problem with this is, while this rock bottom looks good if you were to interfere in a match or be in streetwear, it looks horrible for an actual match. You and the opponent land sideways rather than landing front first. And that is totally accurate to the July 30th episode of Monday Night Raw. Rock slams Vince to a side, and it's completely accurate to that night. But it does look terrible in match. And I hated that this rock bottom was the only rock bottom for the next 6 to 7 games, just with even more theatrics added onto the end. So what I've done to remedy this is, first, the preview build's rock bottom has been added back in, but I haven't removed this rock bottom. No, that's going to stay here just in case you guys want it as well. But then I've also gone and added back in Smackdown 2's rock bottom. Therefore, you can have a choice of 3, just like you could with a stunner or a pedigree or something of that. A little minor note here. The Smackdown 2 rock bottom, which I've named Rock Bottom 2, can be used as a groggy grapple. Now, you're probably wondering, why did I do that? Well, fans of Smackdown 1 and Smackdown 2 know that the rock bottom was always a groggy grapple due to the fact that you couldn't have multiple finishes. That was something new added in Just Bring It. So if you want multiple rock bottoms now, you can have the Smackdown 2 one as a groggy grapple, the preview build as a finisher, and then obviously you have the People's Elbow as your other finisher. But you have tons of choice, just like you do with a lot of the other wrestlers, which I think is always the best thing with these games. Okay, let's talk that Walls of Jericho atop the ladder. Now, I searched every single move in this video game in the preview build that I have, and unfortunately I found the Walls of Jericho animation on the ladder. It is not an animated move, it is a cutscene, and this was obviously just something that was made for story mode that was never really utilized, that's all it was. So really unfortunate about that. Ladder moves don't actually come into the Smackdown series until Smackdown Shut Your Mouth. Alright, let's talk win animations. Firstly, The Rock's return on the 30th of July would again change things in the game, but luckily this time wouldn't leave anything overwritten, just added in. In the preview build, Rock still has his win pose from Smackdown 2, which in this game is called Rock 2. Added in was a win pose that was newly animated last minute called Rock 3. In this game it isn't the default, and it's actually still Rock 2 mirroring the preview version, but I've left Rock 3 in, so it is there. The other interesting thing about this is, since I was playing with the animation data from all these games, these win poses can actually be moved over into Smackdown Shut Your Mouth. So more on that next episode. Okay, let's talk entrances. Well, since we talked about The Rock's return ad nauseam at this point, let's start there. In the preview build, Rock has his 2000 theme and 2000 Titantron, which he used all the way up to WrestleMania 17. In the retail build, unfortunately, he uses his Alliance Titantron and theme song, which I never liked, and also feels extremely out of place in this game. So I've put back in his 2000 theme and 2000 Titantron, and yes, the Alliance themes are completely replaced. Why, you may ask? Well, in the preview build, Rikishi has 2 themes and 2 videos. Yes, he has Badman, but he also has his 2 cool Titantron and music. But that's not entirely why you think he has it. The music isn't actually Rikishi's, it is 2 Cools, or rather, Scotty 2 Hotties, who Sanders Keel confirmed was in the game, and then never was. Just like X-Pac and Just Incredible on my preview build are selectable, but their renders are Jerry Lynn and the character models are Trish Stratus, but I plan on rectifying all of this at a later date. Finishing up with entrances, we have Stone Cold. Now, Stone Cold was lucky here. They kept his Disturbed theme song and just updated the Titantron with the Venomous Titantron and the First Alliance music. But I've actually gone back in and replaced his Alliance Titantron with the Return 2000 Titantron, so it matches with the Disturbed song. Okay, so you know I talk about the little things. Well, here are the original renders from the preview build put back in to the definitive edition. So first up, we're going to look at The Undertaker. This is actually Undertaker's second render. He had a different one in the E3 build as well, which can be seen in some select magazines. Ivory's original render still reflects that she is part of the right censor. Eddie Guerrero's render is more accurate to his character model. Trish Stratus, this is likely a temporary render for the one they're going to replace it with for the final release. Triple H, same deal here. Stephanie McMahon. But the render I really want to show you is Mick Foley. Much like his in-game model in the retail version, they've just gone and plonked a load of fake hair all over this image. Lastly, a little thing. Here's Steve Austin's entrance in the preview build. Notice it says WWF Heavyweight Champion. This actually matches Howard Finkel's call when he introduces you on your way to the ring. In the retail edition, it just says WWF Champion. I've added it back in just because, again, it's one of those little touches that I think are unique to these editions. And then I think that's everything for this version that I've added in. There will be a Q&A next week. But due to the fact that I know Just Bring It probably won't have as many questions as other games, you can ask me questions about Just Bring It, but also people wanted another Q&A for Here Comes the Pain, so you can add and ask questions for Here Comes the Pain as well as anything else you would like to ask me. After going back and putting all this content back in Smackdown Just Bring It, and spending some quality time with it, I do feel differently about the game. While yes, in 2001 it was a big disappointment, but now it actually feels like I have the game that I wanted back then. So I hope you enjoyed this longer edition of Rebuilding Smackdown. If you did, please hit that like button and please subscribe. If you can, support me on Patreon at patreon.com/ScottJ. And until next time, guys, take care.